Today we are going to be talking about fertilizing and watering. I'm going to talk first about fertilizing, and we encourage people to look at fertilizing as plant nutrition, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that here in just a second. But fertilizer, the term fertilizer kind of has a very almost a negative feeling anymore. People think it's all chemistry and just nothing good. But if you look at fertilizers, plant nutrition, it might change your the way that you think. I'm going to show a lot of photographs of a lot of different fertilizers. All these products are for educational purposes only. We're not endorsing, criticizing. So our standard disclaimer is up on the screen that all this is for educational purposes. One thing that we would like to demystify: fertilizers are not plant food. Plants make their own food through photosynthesis. Fertilizers help the plant do it. You will see at your favorite garden center almost every product listed as a plant food. That is 100% marketing. Plants make their own food. We could have a whole class on photosynthesis, but in the simplest terms, plants will take carbon dioxide, use energy from the sun, and make sugars. It's absolutely amazing. John Porter did talk about some of the different types of photosynthesis, but if you ever get an opportunity to learn about it, we would encourage you because it's just absolutely amazing. When it comes to plant nutrition, there are, outside of oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, there are 16 essential plant nutrients. And they can be divided into two groups, macro and micro. It's not that the macronutrients are more important. They're just needed in a larger quantity. If a plant does not have any of these nutrients that are listed on the screen, it's not going to be able to complete its life cycle, which means it might not be able to grow, photosynthesize, flower, set fruit, some form. That all these nutrients are used at some point during the plant's life cycle, and if one of them is missing, the plant will not be happy and healthy. Silicon is down at the bottom. Silicon is one of those quasi-essential nutrients. It's only essential for one family of flowering plants, and that is the equisetum. A lot of you may know of the equisetum. They're that straw-like plant, horsetail rush or scouring rush is a common name for equisetum. It's the only plant out there that absolutely needs silicon for the life cycle to complete. All the other nutrients out there, from nickel to boron, are needed for the plant to do its job. But I wanted to talk about what we refer often to as the big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It is an industry standard that when you look at a fertilizer package, you will see 3, maybe sometimes 4 numbers. They will always be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They will always be in that order. So you're never having to guess, what does that first number mean? That first number is nitrogen. In general terms, or the simplest term, nitrogen is responsible for the green growth. Phosphorus is responsible for root development and sometimes to help encourage flowers. And then potassium's for overall plant health. If you see a fourth number, that fourth number will be sulfur. Most of the times on the commercial side of horticulture, we will not see that fourth number, but on the agriculture side, sometimes that number will be there. I'll talk a little bit here more about what those ratios mean and what ones might be a good one for you to look at. But let's talk about nitrogen first. Nitrogen, again, is responsible for the green growth. There's a lot of other chemistry out there that nitrogen does, but for the simplest term, green growth. When you look at the fertilizer package, you are going to see anywhere from 2 to 3 different types of nitrogen, anywhere from urea to nitrate to water soluble. What I want to point out is urea nitrogen is a man-made nitrogen. Most times on a fertilizer package, that will be the predominant type of nitrogen. There's some debate out there about urea. Urea needs some microorganisms within the soil, some types of bacteria, for that urea to be broken down to a usable form for the plant. Outside in our gardens, our flower vegetable gardens, that's not an issue. But when we talk about a house plant and we're using a sterile soil medium, that bacteria probably isn't present. So a lot of times urea is just an overabundance of a type of nitrogen that your plant can't use. You want to choose a product that's going to have a couple different types of nitrogen. We don't want to rely on just one type, because if you go with all nitrogen, that can actually affect the pH of the soil. It can make it more alkaline. If you go with all ammonium nitrogen, that can actually make the soil more acidic. So we want to go with a balance of different types of nitrogens. And you can see on the slide is that, again, nitrogen is responsible for green growth. And this lettuce leaf is showing you nitrogen deficiency. Now, nitrogen is mobile. So when a plant is getting ready to naturally, for lack of a better term, kill off a leaf, or if that leaf is starting to die, the plant will move that nitrogen out of that leaf into the other parts of the plant. Nitrogen deficiency typically shows up in the older leaves, and because the plant will try to reallocate the nitrogen within the plant. Phosphorus. Phosphorus is the second most abundant nutrient that the plant needs. It's responsible for the root development and for flowers. If a plant is in a deficiency of phosphorus, a lot of times it will show up as an overabundance of anthocyanin. So we might start getting this pinkish, reddish pigmentation on the leaf. There are other environmental factors that can cause that pinkish to reddish coloration as well. So we got to do some investigating before we can really declare that it's a phosphorus deficiency. In the outdoor environment, in the soils here on this side of the state, the eastern side of the state, we rarely see phosphorus as a missing nutrient. Most of the time we see too much phosphorus. But phosphorus in most of our fertilizers for houseplants will be a phosphate formulation. And then we have potassium. Potassium is the third most abundant nutrient that the plant needs. In the simplest terms, it is for overall plant health. So what does that mean? Potassium is going to help with movement of nutrients throughout the plant, uptake of nutrients. It's heavily involved in a lot of different plant processes, but in the simplest term, it's for overall plant health. Since palms are a popular indoor houseplant, we sometimes see phosphorus deficiency in palms, and that will show up by this these brown freckle type lesions. Sometimes they're interveinal. They're going to be along the vein of the plant. That could be an indication that your palm has a potassium deficiency. To be really able to tell if your plant is missing one nutrient over another, you can get some tissue samples done. Midwest Laboratories here in Omaha does tissue testing. So that is one way you can find out. But in the general, simplest term, potassium is for overall plant health. One way you can remember what these numbers mean or what they do is to remember up, down, all around. Nitrogen's for up, vertical growth, phosphorus is for our roots, and potassium is for all around plant health. pH. John Porter talked about pH earlier, and pH is just a measurement of how alkaline or how acidic something might be. When it comes to plant nutrition, the pH will have a really important play in the availability of these nutrients. 7 is considered neutral. As we increase from 7, we become more alkaline. And as you can see, as we become more alkaline, some of our micronutrients like iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc become less available. And then as we're a little bit more acidic, we're less than 7, a lot of times these nutrients are all available. And so most of our plants enjoy a pH about 6.5, give or take, in a ballpark figure. And this is because all those nutrients are available for the plant. Now I'll talk to you about how to measure that pH here in just a second. So the pH is really important. Chlorosis, we see this a lot of times on our pin oak trees, and that is because the pin oak tree is not able to pick up iron because of the alkalinity of the soil. So that can be something that you can kind of put a theory into practice. So when you're trying to figure out what the pH of your soil, these two items on this particular slide, don't use them. They're a good feel-good item. They're not going to give you a very accurate measurement of what that pH is going to be. Those probes, those shake and bake type things, just are not the best items out there. If you truly want to measure the pH, you're going to need to spend a little bit of money and get yourself a pH meter. And you want to have a pH meter that you can calibrate, because we want to be able to calibrate this device so we know that it's working properly. And the best way to measure the pH of your soil of a houseplant is to run some water through that, capture that water, and use the pH meter. Make sure that we're using distilled water, because well water could have other additives. Tap waters can skew it, but when you're using distilled water, you want it fresh. You don't want you want to go to the store, pick it up and use it, because as soon as you take the cap off of that distilled water, the pH of the water can start changing due to just a lot of chemistry that I can't remember from college, but a lot of stuff can happen. So we want to make sure that we have that distilled water, run it through the potting mix soil, capture that water. Use a plastic container, don't use a metal container, because that can skew the pH reading as well. So when you go to your favorite garden center, there are more options of fertilizers than there are of cereal at the grocery store. You are going to be bombarded with hundreds of different types of fertilizers. I worked at the garden center retail nursery business for about a dozen years. And I can tell you, if you want to sell a fertilizer, you need to put a tomato on it. And you will sell more fertilizer than you know what to do with just by putting a tomato on it. And there's just so many options out there. Monstera is becoming a very popular houseplant, and now they have a special Monstera plant food out there. Again, it's not food, it's nutrition. What should you pick up? Which one are you going to go with? One of the industry standards is a flat 1-1-1 ratio, which means those three nutrients are going to be like a 1-1-1, a 5-5-5, 10-10-10. You get that, you get the drift. Another industry standard is a 3-1-2 ratio, which is 3% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, 2% potassium. And it can be in any of those combination as like a, what is it, a 9-3-6 is another variation. But those have been pretty much the industry standard. Some plants like acidic soil. You just need to know your plants a little bit better. So you might need to get something that has sulfur in it to help lower the pH. But for the most part, you are going to be bombarded with so many options. It can be daunting. When you're trying to choose a fertilizer for your plants, try to buy in the smallest amount possible. Because if your plants don't react well to it, you don't want to be left with a bunch of fertilizer that you might not use. And if, as David mentioned, I am a huge African violet gesneriid grower. And if I'm trying something new as in a fertilizer, we'd want to try it on just maybe a handful of our plants and not everybody, because if a plant doesn't like it, if it doesn't respond in a positive manner, we're not doing any type of damage. When it comes to when should you fertilize your plants, the plant should be actively growing. Fertilizers force a plant to grow, and if a plant is in any type of stress, be it a tree or a shrub outside or African violet indoors, if they're under some distress, we don't want to fertilize it because we can make the problem worse. We also want to make sure that the plant isn't in drought stress. And that's kind of funny to think when we are thinking about indoor plants, but drought stress just means that we forget to water, and then we feel like we need to add something to the water to make the plant happy. We don't want to. We want the plant to be well hydrated before we fertilize the plant, because fertilizer in the water could cause some issues down the road. So the plant should be actively growing, so which means we're going to be seeing new green growth coming out of that plant, and it should be well hydrated. We don't want it to be any type of water distress. I'm sure we can have lots of great conversations about which one we should use, which one works for you. If you have a product that's working for you, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But if something's not working, hey, it might be worthwhile to look for. One thing about these products, these are all common on the market, but you want to make sure that you read the label. Here at this slide, we have the Bonsai Fertilizer. It's a 7-9-5 ratio. Right next to it is a Grow formula, 7-9-5 ratio. The Bonsai Fertilizer has a really nice, cute label. That goes for about $12.99 in the retail setting. The product right next to it, exact same thing, but it doesn't have a cute, fuzzy, warm-feeling label. That goes for about $9.99. So check the label, because a lot of times out there, specialty fertilizers, the only difference between that is the photograph on the label. The nutrients and everything else is the exact same. So make sure that you're reading the label. Read the label. It's going to tell you how much you need to use. If it says a tablespoon, use a tablespoon. More is not better when it comes to fertilizer. So read that label, follow those instructions. One of the things that we often do as houseplant enthusiasts that will make up a batch of fertilizers, do it a couple days ahead before we're watering. That's not necessarily recommended. We want to use it the day that we mix it, because there's a lot of chemistry going on in that water, and those nutrients can become not inactivated, but not available for the plant. So use it the day that you mix it and follow the instructions, and do your family a favor, write on that milk jug fertilizer water, so that way it doesn't accidentally get used somewhere else. You will also see fertilizer spikes. Nobody in extensions recommends any type of fertilizer spikes, from tree spikes outdoors to houseplant spikes. And the reason behind this, it puts a lot of nutrients right in a tiny itty bitty space, and we could do more damage to the root system of the plant. Fertilizer spikes are not recommended for any type of plant, from outdoors to indoors. And then when it comes to the source of the product, organic versus traditional means, that can be a whole nother debate. We all have our personal thoughts and feelings about it. Organic does not mean it's safer, but we also need to keep in mind that organic products like fish emulsion comes from fish, and you're not going to have a house party and water a couple hours before with fish emulsions, because all your plants are going to smell like fish. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. Organic products often come with a distinct aroma. Might be good for an outdoor situation, but for indoors, maybe not so much. All right. That is what I had. Was there any quick questions I can help answer before we move on to Kathleen?
So there was one good question that we had that I wanted to make sure we answered. Does it need to be special indoor houseplant fertilizer, or can you use what you use in the garden?
That is a wonderful question. You want to read the label. That product is going to tell you, where it can be used. If it's a general plant fertilizer, there's a good chance that you can use it across the board. So a lot of times there are products that are meant for outdoor, indoor. Check that label. It will tell you where you should use it.
And then another question, well hydrated. Does this mean that you fertilize a few days after you water?
It just means that we've all done this, that we walked away, that we go on vacation, or that we just plain forget to water our plants. So that plant has gone maybe 10 to 14 days without being watered. We want to water it first, so that way it's no longer under any type of water stress, because that if we add fertilizer to that water, we might do damage to the root system of the plant.
And this is a specialty one, but you might know the answer better than I do. Do you know sources of silicon for equisetum that requires high levels of silicon?
It, believe it or not, there are fertilizers out there that specialize in silicon. One, again, no endorsements implied, but DynaGrow does have a silicon-based fertilizer. Now, a lot of us don't grow equisetum as an ornamental, so not necessarily an issue. And silicon in Nebraska soil is not in deficiency. And I apologize. I think I caught a cold, so my nose is running like a faucet. Any other questions I can help with before we move on to watering?
A general recommendation for ratios for houseplant fertilizer of the NPKs?
A 1-1-1 ratio So that could be a 1-1-1, a 5-5-5, 10-10-10, or a 3-1-2.
How often should we fertilize?
That is a great question. That is a great question. That could be a long discussion. Ideally, when the plant is actively growing, you should be at least fertilizing once, twice a month. There are some schools of thoughts that recommend a weekly, which means that we use a diluted formulation of the fertilizer every time we water when it's actively growing.
Scott, when you're talking about actively growing, can you address winter time?
Great question. A lot of times during the winter, our plants are still under grow lights, like our cactus and succulents, but they're not actively growing. We're not seeing any new green growth. We're not seeing any type of new stem or leaf development, where the plant's just kind of sitting out there in a quasi dormancy. So like in African violet, they constantly grow underneath grow lights. So we see that new green growth coming out from that center of the rosette. Our viney type plants, our philodendrons, pothos, where they're constantly growing, we see that new green growth coming out. If we don't see that new green growth, that means the plant is kind of in a dormancy, like tropical hibiscus. They've been brought in. They're just hanging out right now. They're not doing much of anything.
And someone is asking for a 5-minute primer on growing African violets, but we'll have to pass on that one for right now. Maybe you can follow up with them later.
Yes, please email me. I'll be more happy to help with that.
And I think that's all we have for houseplants. I want to answer a few more in the question and answer, but I think we're ready for watering now.
All right.
All right, well, I'm going to stop my video just because my connections can be a little iffy sometimes, and just that's going to help. So that's why you're not seeing me live anyway. So when it comes to houseplants, what we tend to see a lot in extension is both ends of the spectrum. Somebody that's forgetful and they're not watering them at all. That's drought conditions for the plant and they succumb. The reverse is true. People can love their house plants to death just by watering them too often. They can literally lead to drowning them. And at times, some of the questions we get, I almost think that one of the recommendations we should be making is on marital counseling, because the whole houseplants and who's taking care of them and who isn't can be quite contentious. And so this is a reason for talking about watering so that we can at least get on the same page as to what to do for plants to make them healthy. And so I'll be going through about the when, the how, well, what kind of water to use, who should be doing it. That's along the same lines of what we talked about. And then David, I'll talk a little bit more about humidity. So could you advance the slide, please, Scott? So when to water. First, it requires an understanding on our parts that there are a lot of different types of plants out there. And our leafy house plants tend to be of an origin that is tropical. And those areas certainly get a lot more water in nature than they do, say, like things that are cacti and succulents. So cacti are those fleshy things that have spines of some sort. Succulents are those ones that are just very fleshy as well, but there's no spines on them. And so a lot of cacti and succulents are going to need less water than something that you would do necessarily for house plants that are leafy in nature. So keep that in mind, because that's going to influence how much water and when to water okay? The time of year is also going to be a big deal. You heard David talk about, the really warm temperatures that are very, very dry inside of our houses during the winter months. That means that those plants are losing water faster than they normally would, maybe even during the summer months when our air conditioners are on. So keep that in mind as well. A time of year will also influence as to when you're going to water. And everybody highlighted some really cool soil moisture meters that you can use. Can you put one of those images up, Scott? Thank you. So they have some really cool things out there now where you really don't have to think much about it. You just put the meter inside the potting mix and it goes to your phone. It'll tell you all kinds of things. And one of those will tell you about the moisture that's in that soil. Next image too, Scott. But really, your finger is very sophisticated device for finding out just how much moisture is in the water. And I never want to see anybody just touch the top of the soil because that really doesn't give you a good idea of how much moisture is in there. So, get your finger in there. If you can get it into the first digit, that's going to be your best measure as to tell you as to what's going on. And if it feels dry, then by all means water at that point. If it's moist, don't water. Next slide. So how to water. And we hope everybody has containers that have drainage holes in them because that's a critical part of plant care and plant health. And we want to water to the point where there's water coming out of that drainage hole. That way the whole soil profile has water that's going throughout, and any roots that are throughout that soil profile are getting the moisture they need. So we want that excess to come out the bottom. Now you can drain that water in the sink, so you can just put the pot in the sink, let it drain out that way, or you can have a catch dish underneath it. If you do have a catch dish underneath it, you want to leave it sitting there for about 30 minutes because what will happen is there'll be maybe more drainage, but a certain amount of wicking back to rehydrate some of those spaces that didn't get fully hydrated when you initially watered it. But you don't want to leave it sit in there. It's really important that that catch dish is pulled out, emptied out 30 minutes or so later, and then put back underneath the plant. Okay, next image, Scott. And this is why. Okay, so whenever we have water that goes out, what we're doing is we're leaching away a lot of those excess minerals that are dissolved in the water. And when we're using that kind of water and those excess minerals go into the catch dish, we're emptying those out, okay? If it's left in place, what tends to happen is those minerals, nutrients can get wicked back up and redeposited on the soil surface. And so things like watering from the bottom, wicking, those things we do very rarely just because of that whole issue of that deposition of the hard water deposits back up on the soil surface. And that can cause some plant problems. Here in the Midwest, we have very hard water. Our bedrock is limestone. And so a lot of our minerals in the water are calcium. And so you can have a preponderance of those things and it can really shift the pH of the soil over time. So being aware of just, emptying out that catch dish is going to be really important. And the next image, Scott. This gives you a good idea of what that white deposit looks like. And so that's why it's really important that we empty out or use the wicking only maybe when we're on vacation and we don't have anybody to water our house plants for us, minimizing the amount of watering from the bottom. Next slide. So what kind of water do we use? Is there anything, for some people that are new to house plants, they think water is water and any kind of water will do. And that really is not the case. And probably the water you absolutely positively want to stay away from is softened water. the process that's used in order to soften that water has high amounts of salt in it. Those salts can build up in the potting soil and be a real problem. So absolutely do not use anything like that. Next image, Scott. So one thing that I've been known to do to get that good quality water is I have well water, and so I know that there's a lot of hardness associated with that water. I've been known to go out and get a bucket of snow and bring it indoors and let it melt down. Very high quality water. If you collect rainwater, you can certainly use that. Those are all things that are higher quality water than softened water. So keep that in mind. And the temperature of that water that you use is extremely important as well. So extremely cold, very hot water interferes with not only water uptake, but the nutrients that are dissolved in that water. And so if you're trying to fertilize, it can actually interfere with that uptake of nutrients if you got that water temperature wrong. And the best way to do that is it should be tepid to room temperature. That's the range that you want it in. And so if you've collected snow, you don't want to use that snow just as soon as it's melted, because that water is just off of freezing, wrong temperature. So let it come up to room temperature. I've seen plant tags where they say on them that, you know, an easy way to water is throw a few ice cubes on it. And then I was reading a magazine one time about, you know, time-saving tips to use in the household. And one of them was to throw ice on the top of plants in order to water them. I don't want to see anybody ever do that. That's just really, really hard on plants. You think about tropical plants. Tropical plants, 40 degrees is freezing for them. And so you think about ice melting, that temperature of that water is 34 degrees or slightly higher. So you're watering plants then with water that's really freezing to our tropicals. So never use ice. And then the other image, Scott. And this is something that you'll see when you have a buildup of either hard water deposits, chlorine, fluoride in plants. You'll see this brown tipping occur on some of your plants. And if you're seeing that, then that's the strongest indicator you'll have that you need to change the source of your water. And so those things, what the tips represent are an accumulation of things at those very ends of those leaves. So the thing to remember about chlorine is that it readily evaporates out of water. So if you're collecting, if you're getting water from the tap and you're allowing to sit out overnight, yes, that chlorine is evaporating out from there, but the fluoride does not. The fluoride stays put. And so if you're seeing the fluoride as an issue because of this browning of the leaf tip, then that's something as another reason to change the water source. Next slide, Scott. So who should water? And so I talked a little bit about how it can be a source of difficulty in a household when there's multiple people that are trying to care for the plants. And really it needs to be a designated person or a schedule for people to do that. The effects of overwatering and underwatering manifest themselves as almost exactly the same thing. When we overwater, we lead to an increase of fungal issues at the root zone. And when that occurs, then the plant's not able to take up water as well, and the plant tissues collapse. The same is true of how when a plant's dying of drought, we kill root function, it's not able to take up water as well, and plant tissues collapse. So they both look the same when those issues are happening. And so there have been instances where, you know, someone leaves the watering can right next to the house plants. And then what happens is somebody's walking by, doesn't realize that somebody's already watered. So they'll just give it a quick dip of water there again. And you can quickly get to a point where overwatering is an issue. So absolutely, maybe have a designated person or have a schedule. And regardless of who it is in the household that's doing it, make sure they have an understanding of what the plant needs are that I had talked about earlier, you know, cacti versus leafy plants. Those kind of things can really affect how much water you give a plant. Next slide. And David talked about this too, is that, you know, the different ways that you can humidify or raise the amount of moisture around plants. And one way that this can be done is misting. And I was really glad to see that David pointed out that this is kind of a temporary thing. You know, it maybe humidifies the plant for 5 minutes or so. And so unless you're willing to just stand right by the plant and give it a mist every 10 minutes or so, it's not a real practical way to raise the humidity around plants. And then Scott had mentioned too that if you're using the wrong kind of water to mist the plants with, you can get those hard water deposits on the leaf surface as well. Next image. And so you can build something like a pebble tray. And if you're unfamiliar with this, this is just a very shallow tray filled with pebbles. And when water is put in the tray, it doesn't quite cover the pebbles. So when you set your plants in there, they're not sitting directly in the water. Okay, what you're doing then is you're creating an environment that allows that moisture to evaporate. And when it evaporates, then it humidifies around the plant. There was an instance one time where somebody was showing me they were so proud of their pebble tray that they had created, but the pebble tray was barely wider than the catch dish that the plant was in. And that really wasn't doing an adequate job of humidifying the air around the plant. Really, the pebble tray should be as wide as the foliage is of the plant. So make sure that if you're creating a pebble tray, that you're doing something wide enough to accommodate all those leaves, that they're all being humidified. And then the last image, Scott. And so group the plants together. That's the easiest way to do that. You'll still, this time of year when our indoor humidity is so low, you still may be seeing some browning of leaves, but for the most part, if you're grouping them together, you're going to have issues maybe with insects problems or disease problems that they can share if they're touching one another that will be addressed later. But it also, the positive side is that it will humidify, they'll humidify each other. And so that's a really good way to do it as well. So that is it. That's all we had for you about watering and fertilizing. If there's any questions right now.
We've answered most of them by typing, but we did have a few. So I know we've already answered this in text, but is the photo with the pebble tray, you also have cash dishes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the correct way to do it?
Yes. Yeah. So the idea here is that the plant itself, and so whenever you have an actual pot that's in direct contact with the pebbles, there's a certain amount of wicking that can go on. And remember what I said the problem was about wicking is that redepositing of hardened minerals and other things on the soil surface, which can cause problems eventually. So that's why it's a good idea to have those catch dishes underneath, is that you're still getting the water that's going down in. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't dump it out when you're emptying that catch dish into the pebble tray. But for the most part, we don't want the plants themselves, the pots themselves, in direct contact with those pebbles.
Also, we've gotten a few questions about using like a Brita filter on tap water. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, and that's actually a really good point. If you have one of those things that you can put onto your faucet that takes out everything, or one of those pitchers that take out everything, including chlorine, including fluoride, then yes, that's a very good quality water to use as well.
And I think we're getting a few more. Do pebble trays breed insects? We got that one in the. Not that I know of.
Not that I know of either. In most instances where the pebble trays cause an issue, it's not well, let me shift that a little bit. In instances where people are overwatering, then certainly things like fungus gnats are really going to like to be into that soil. And that's a point where they will be laying eggs in that potting soil. And in those instances, if you're overwatering, yes, you can actually get some issues. If your pebble tray has a lot of debris in it besides stones, then that's going to be a place where they could potentially lay eggs as well. So cleaning those occasionally is going to be important.
And is watering one symptom of overwatering or watering? A symptom is that the top versus the bottom leaves die on a plant. We got that question.
Not necessarily. So all leaves go through a plant, a cycle of necrosis. You know, they come out, they photosynthesize, and they gradually decline. And that's just a normal part of plant function. And sometimes, well, if you see the oldest leaves that are dying, that's a normal part of plant processes. It's when you see the newest leaves dying that it's an indication of some other issue going on. And it's important to try to pinpoint the cause of that issue and address it, because the newest leaves tend to be the most photosynthetically efficient leaves. And so when we see problems with them, there's an issue with the plant.
So how do you clean out a pebble tray?
The hard way. Yeah, it's all about taking the plants off. You know, if you can take it outside and just rinse it off with the garden hose, that's an easy way to do it. Otherwise, if you're relegated to the indoors, then it's going to be a matter of maybe putting all the pebbles in a colander or something like that to rinse them all off, rinse out the tray, put the pebbles back, and you're good to go again.
Okay, well, we don't have any more in the hopper right now. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to, we have a few minutes left that we can answer those. I will say on the filter, you know, someone was sharing in the chat that Brita does not remove fluoride, which is true. There is a filter that I have that removes most everything from the water, including most fluoride. It's called a zero water. You can get it as a pitcher or the thing to go on your faucet. And it actually comes with a meter, a total dissolved solid meter that you can test your water to make sure that your filter is still working effectively. So not that I'm promoting that, but.
Well, and the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, not all plants succumb to fluoride problems, you know, if there's an abundance of fluoride. So my experience, the ones that tend to have a lot of problems are the peace lily, spathiphyllum, and their Dracaena, the corn plants. They tend to have issues with fluoride.
Yeah, so I think that's, you know, you don't have to go to all these links for every plant. Like if you know, there are just some that have those that are more or less tolerant to like fluoride and chlorine than others. So you don't have to filter all the water that you use if you don't want to. You just have to identify those, right?
Yes, that is true.
And then one more, we're going to answer this in terms of watering. Clay pots versus plastic pots, or maybe glazed ceramic. Like a terracotta clay pot, do you have to water that more?
Generally speaking, you do have to water a terracotta pot more often than you would a plastic pot. Conversely, if you've gone too long before you've watered and you're finally watering again, the plastic pot, it seems like the water resists you watering that plant. And so for whatever reason, it's harder to water a plant in a plastic pot when it's gone on too long. It seems like you get more of that shedding of the water out the drainage hole and into the catch dish. So that's a consideration. For the vast majority of people that I work with when it comes to watering houseplants, mostly I see them overwater. And if they're overwatering, it's nice if they're using clay pots, just because you're getting that quicker drying out phase. One important component that I didn't really touch on is that plant roots need oxygen as much as they need water. And so that drying out process is a key process that goes on to help the plant survive. And so it's the drying out of those soil pore spaces that allow the oxygen to get into the soil. And so drying out of the soil is not necessarily a problem as long as it's eventually rewatered again. It's when it's watered all the time, every day, you eliminate that ability of oxygen to get into those pore spaces, because there are no empty spaces. They're all filled with water. So it's an important component to make sure that we let things dry out to a certain extent. And how dry it needs to be is something that you'll find out, you know, with your finger when you're testing things. And so that's a real key component.
Kathleen, I'm glad you really mentioned that, because it is a matter of watering, but it's also a matter of frequency. And I think that's a key component. I think people use the word overwatering when they mean frequency. And because plants do need to dry out a little bit from time to time, and people water every day, you know, and that becomes a big problem. So overwatering is a bit of a misnomer just in that term itself.
Yeah, and you can actually have instances where people are doing very shallow watering and they're doing it every single day, and that's equally bad. It's good to water so that that full soil profile inside the pot is watered and it's coming out that drainage hole in the bottom. That way, you know, all the roots are getting some water. And so that's a good idea too. Thanks, John.
That is one of the most often, that's one of the questions we get most often, is how much water should we give plants? People like to quantify it. Is it a cup, 16 ounces? Like Kathleen said, it should be till it comes out of the bottom of the pot.